Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. If you're listening to this episode on or around the date it was released, then please accept my apologies. I didn't get it out on schedule, and that was simply because of my work demands. I teach continuing legal education for a living, and the fourth quarter of every year is the craziest, and I've just been traveling so much that I wasn't able to find the time to get the episode recorded. Now, even though I'm still in the throes of the busy season, it's almost coming to an end, so I'm pretty sure I'll be posting the next episode on time on the 15th of the month, and I expect to be on target for releasing episodes every 2 weeks, as usual going forward. If I have any schedule changes in the future, I'll be posting those updates on my social media pages, so please follow Good Lawyers Gone Bad on Instagram and the Good Lawyers Gone Bad Facebook page. Those are the two places that I'm going to post updates going forward. Today's story is straight up crime. What's incredible about it is that the story shows how no one is safe when a criminal is cornered and their nefarious schemes are in danger of being exposed. They will go to incredible lengths to protect themselves, and they don't care who they'll hurt or what devastation will be left in their wake, even if they are a well-respected lawyer. Before we get started on the story, let me give you one slight disclaimer. In this program, I created the dialogue between the characters. Normally, I read affidavits and certifications and everything else that I can get my hands on, and I include the actual words that came out of people's mouths in these stories. But in this case, all of the documents are under seal. That means that someone made application to the court to remove those documents from the public record, so I couldn't read them. In order to make the story a little more interesting, I used a little literary license here and there, and I made up the dialogue. Now, the ideas that the people talked about in the story, they're real. The conversations actually happened, and they really did talk about the things I wrote about. I just made up the actual words that came out of their mouth. But come on, isn't that what they do in true crime reenactments in movies and TV anyway? Please remember to like the podcast on whatever platform you use. Leaving a nice review would be great as well. Enjoy today's episode. Sarah looked down at her hands and watched them tremble. She looked at the numbers on the small scrap of paper she held between her quivering fingers. On it were several numbers she'd been searching for some time. She hoped that they would lead her to the information she needed, the information that would protect her and her children. But having those numbers, well, that wouldn't be enough. Sarah needed to take those numbers with her downstairs, down into the section of the house that she was not allowed to enter. Sarah wasn't allowed down in the basement. It was declared by her husband to be his private space. There's no telling how far her husband would fly off the handle if he knew that Sarah was going downstairs. And he would probably be apoplectic if he knew that Sarah had those numbers. The numbers that would allow her to open her husband's safe. The safe where she believed, where she hoped, no, where she prayed that she would find information that would save Sarah and her 2 children. Sweat dripped from Sarah's face as she opened the basement door. It was August and the air conditioning in her home was broken, but let's face it, the perspiration was probably more likely generated by nerves. For some time now, living with Fred had been like walking a tightrope. Sarah had to proceed delicately to avoid setting off her husband's temper. So maybe it was a subconscious fear that made her walk down the stairs on her tiptoes, gingerly and silently, even though her husband wasn't in the house at the time. As Sarah spun the dial in the safe, beads of sweat rolled down her nose. She finished applying the combination and then grabbed the lever on the side door. She pulled down the lever and felt the metal mechanism inside the door release. As she tried to pull the heavy door open, the bead of sweat dangling from the tip of her nose dropped to the basement floor, leaving a single wet splatter by her feet. Sarah yanked at the door, and finally she was able to pull it wide open. Sarah stood in front of the open safe. She looked at the assortment of contents, and then she turned her head, looked at the man standing next to her, and said, "So, what do you think?" Imagine you're 18 years old. You're standing alone in a grassy field with no one around you. You're just there waiting for something to happen. You can hear the sound of your breath, You can feel your heart pumping loudly, but you can't move. Then, all around you, people start to shriek. You can hear the screaming, but you can't really make out any of the faces. And then a crowd of people charge toward you. They're not just charging toward you, they're looking to do you harm. You try to evade them, but no matter where you run, they never stop their pursuit. That may sound like an actual nightmare for most people, but to 18-year-old Deion Sanders, it was heaven. The grassy field Deion was standing on was inside the football stadium at Florida State University. It was 1985, and the player who would go on to be known as Primetime was an 18-year-old freshman. On this December day, Deion Sanders was having the greatest game of his very young college career. He already returned 2 punts for over 30 yards, each time coming this close to breaking them for touchdowns. But now, Deion was playing defense, and his game was about to get even better. The University of Tulsa was facing a critical play. It was just before halftime, it was 4th down, and they were on the goal line. A touchdown was just a few yards away, and the team decided to go for it. Deion Sanders lined up at the goal line, one-on-one with a receiver. When the ball was snapped, the receiver started to cut inside on a slant. As the quarterback released the ball, the receiver took that last stride over the goal line. He raised his hands and made a diamond shape with his fingers, just as he was taught, waiting for the pass to hit the target. But the instant before the ball hit his hands, Deion Sanders jumped in front of the receiver and snatched the ball out of the air. Deion tucked the ball into his ribcage and instinctively started to run. When he looked up, he was shocked by what he saw. Nothing. Deion looked at the field in front of him, and there was simply no one there. Everyone in the stands saw it too. When Deion started to run, the stadium erupted. Deion kicked it into high gear and took off down the field. He went 100 yards untouched. To this day, it is the longest interception for a touchdown in Florida State Seminole history. Deion Sanders would go on to have a stellar career at Florida State. Some say he was the most electrifying FSU player of all time. And Deion would take that excitement to the NFL. In April of 1989, Deion Sanders was selected as the 5th overall pick in the NFL draft by the Atlanta Falcons. In the early 1990s, there was no one bigger in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, than Deion Sanders. Well, that's not true. There was actually one person who was both bigger in stature and probably had a bigger name at that time. His name was Dominique Wilkins. Dominique Wilkins was a forward for the local NBA franchise, the Atlanta Hawks. Dominique was known as one of the greatest dunkers in basketball history, and his incredible talents gave him the nickname the Human Highlight Film. At 6'8" tall, Dominique towered over Deion Sanders physically, and his name was probably bigger than Deion's in Atlanta that time as well. It was inevitable that the paths of these two men would cross. They probably didn't realize, however, that their paths would intersect in the business world. And they certainly didn't expect that they would also both cross paths with some of the most notorious drug dealers in the Atlanta area. Drug dealers who might have had a hand in running both of those two superstars out of the city of Atlanta. Those drug dealers were named Jesse Ferguson and Julius Klein. Jesse Ferguson stood in the center of the room alongside another guy. They were both looking at a third man who was sitting on the couch. The guy on the couch couldn't sit still. He was fidgeting. He was uncomfortable. He was frightened. Jesse looked at him and thought to himself, "Damn straight, you should be fucking scared." The guy standing next to Jesse spoke up. He said, "This is the guy, Jesse. This is the asshole I told you about." The guy on the couch nearly jumped out of his seat. "Hey, man, come on. I told you got this all wrong." Shut the fuck up, Jesse said. He turned to the guy standing next to him. "Hey, man, why don't you go get a beer or something for a few hours? Leave me and my new friend here alone to talk." The guy on the couch protested. "Come on, man. You don't need to do this." "I said shut the fuck up, Michael. Shut the fuck up." Jesse shut the door behind the guy who left, and turned back to look at Michael, who was sitting nervously on the couch. Actually, he was far more than nervous. Michael was shaking with fear. It made sense. Michael was being confronted by one of the best-known drug dealers in Atlanta. Jesse Ferguson was one half of the Ferguson-Klein drug team. Jesse Ferguson and Julius Klein were drug dealers in Detroit in the mid-1980s. The thing about being a drug dealer, though, is sometimes you overstay your welcome in a particular city. Whether it's because of heat from the police or pressure from rival dealers, sometimes you just know it's time to take off. So, in the 1980s, Ferguson and Klein moved from Detroit all the way down south to Atlanta, Georgia. Ferguson and Klein's drug business was thriving in Atlanta. It was doing so well that they needed some place to stash all the money they were making. One of the places they kept that cash was the apartment that Jesse Ferguson was standing in at the moment. And that's why Michael was on that couch, sweating. Jesse said, "Let me tell you what's going on here, Michael." He was pacing in the room. "Lately, some of the money that Julius and I keep in this apartment has started to disappear. And I think you're the one who's skimming it." Michael started to stand up to protest, but Jesse pushed him back down on the couch. "You've been stealing my money, haven't you, motherfucker?" Michael pleaded, "No, I swear I didn't. I wouldn't fuck you like that, Jesse. You and Julius, you're my boys. I wouldn't steal from you guys." "Yeah, bullshit," Jesse screamed. "I hired a private investigator to follow you around, Michael, and he said that you're buying shit, expensive shit. Where the fuck did you get the money for fur coats and a new car?" Michael said, "I don't know what you're talking about, Jesse. I swear." Now Jesse was furious. He reached his hand around his back and pulled a handgun out of his waistband. He pushed Michael against the back of the couch and jammed the gun in his mouth. Michael heard a few of his teeth break. "You took that money from this apartment, Michael. I know you did. My money, motherfucker. Julius's money. Tell me where it is." Michael started to speak, and Jesse pulled the gun out of his mouth. He continued to insist that he didn't know where the money was, but Jesse didn't believe him. For the next 3 hours, Jesse tortured Michael. But it was all a waste of time. Jesse doesn't seem to have ever recovered that money. But you know what? He sure as shit sent a message. You do not fuck with Jesse Ferguson and Julius Klein. But being successful as a drug dealer can be frustrating. I don't mean the drug dealing part, although to tell you the truth, I don't actually know much about that part of the business. But as a lawyer, I can appreciate their other frustrating reality. They were making so much money selling drugs that they were running out of places to put it. They ended up having to stash their cash all over the city. I mean, they didn't have much of a choice. Drug dealers can't just go into a bank with a barrel load of cash and open up a CD. Someone's going to want to know where all that cash came from. In fact, you can't even really spend it. That's actually the hardest part about being a criminal. It's easy to sell drugs or steal money. The hard part is finding a way to use all that money. I mean, let's say you're a drug dealer and you have a good week. You want to spend some of your hard-earned pay, right? Well, you can't exactly throw $100,000 in dusty white cash on the counter at Harry Winston's and say, as Kanye might have put it, "Let me see that diamond-encrusted piece." Someone's going to think that maybe that cash came from illegal activities. You got to find ways to make that cash seem legit. Too legit to quit, of course. Yes, that was 2 hip-hop references within a minute of each other. And yes, I know I'm playing fast and loose with the term hip-hop when I apply it to MC Hammer. Regardless, that quandary is probably what brought Jesse Ferguson and Julius Klein to Atlanta to begin with. If you want to use that drug money, you got to find a way to launder it. And there was an industry in Atlanta that was perfect for a couple of guys who wanted to wash some drug money. Hotlanta had a thriving nightclub scene. Nightclubs are perfect for money laundering because they are cash businesses. When you launder money, you don't actually make it legitimate. You just make it appear to be legitimate. One of the ways to get that done is through a cash business. A criminal will start a legitimate business that deals mostly in cash. As the legitimate company does business, they legitimately deposit a lot of cash in the bank from those legitimate business dealings. But along with those legitimate deposits, the criminal slips in some drug money. They deposit their ill-gotten gains into the bank accounts for that business along with the legit money. They just mix it all together. Since the business is primarily a cash business, none of those frequent cash deposits raise any suspicion. And even if anyone looked, it would probably be difficult for them to tell which of the cash is legit and which is not, how much of it was legitimately made and how much of it was not. That's why a cash business like car washes, commercial ATM businesses, and nightclubs are popular among criminals. Nightclubs in particular are perfect for cocaine dealers like Jesse Ferguson and Julius Klein. Not only did it give them a place to launder their money, but it gave them an outlet for their drug sales. The pair would buy a crap ton of coke from out of town, bring it to Atlanta, then sell it out of their clubs. The money they'd make selling coke would be invested. They'd purchase other clubs, out of which they would sell more drugs, and they just repeat the process. Of course, Jesse and Julius weren't the type of guys who let a good business opportunity go to waste, so they didn't just sell drugs retail out of their clubs. They had a nice wholesale business going on too. They knew a bunch of other guys who both invested in nightclubs and sold drugs on the side. Guys like Al Brown, Willie Harris, and Eddie Lawrence. Let's just call all of them the Clubs and Coke crew. Ferguson and Klein's reputation was growing in Atlanta. That's good for the drug business, but it's terrible for the nightclub business because it chases away a key demographic. Here's what I mean. One of the ways to ensure that your nightclub attracts a lot of people is to have a marquee name associated with it. Like, a professional athlete. For their part, the athletes are happy to play a role. Players often need a place to invest their excess earnings, and nightclubs are a perfect option because their name almost guarantees attracting a large clientele. But none of those athletes want to get into bed with drug dealers. That's why Ferguson and Klein couldn't be the face of the clubs they invested in. They both had criminal records, and everyone knew they were drug dealers. So they found a guy who could be the face of their investments. A guy without a criminal record who also happened to know how to run nightclubs named James Mason. And that is how two drug dealers got into a nightclub deal with the biggest name in the NBA in the early 1990s. Jesse Ferguson, Julius Klein, and the new face of their business, James Mason, all hooked up with the big man from the Atlanta Hawks to open up the club called Dominique's on Windy Hill Road in Atlanta. It is highly unlikely that Dominique knew that the people he was getting into business with were drug dealers. Mason was the face of the business, and Mason was known as a legitimate club operator in the city. And the way the deal was structured made it seem like Dominique was probably just a partner in name only. The company run by Ferguson and Klein basically rented the place, and they operated the club under the name Dominique's. You'd think that Dominique's would be a smashing success, and it appears that it was initially, but the early 1990s became unexpectedly tough for nightclubs financially. One of those reasons were DUI tickets. Yeah, in years past, DUIs weren't really a big thing, but in the 90s, cops started to enforce the law a lot more, and penalties became stiffer. That hurt the club scene. Plus, the AIDS epidemic was in full swing, which kept a lot of people away from the clubs. Both of those things put pressure on the nightclub industry. And for Dominique's, it didn't help at all when Ferguson and Klein's drug connection was revealed. When that happened, their management group was booted from the club, and Dominique's ended up closing down. But the club on Windy Hill Road wouldn't stay vacant for long. That's because the face of the club, James Mason, well, he was a club guy and he had contacts. But the guy who'd play a key part in reopening the club was going to make the deal a little more complicated. Lucky for them, they knew a lawyer who could help them out. Did you ever see the movie The Untouchables with Sean Connery and Kevin Costner? It's the story about how FBI agent Elliot Ness caught and convicted Al Capone. By the way, do you know what Sean Connery's best line in a movie is? And no, it's not Bond, James Bond. It's in the last scene of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Sean Connery plays Indiana Jones' father, and throughout the movie he refers to Harrison Ford as Junior. At the end of the movie, another character says, "Indy, why does your father keep calling you Junior?" Well, it turns out that his name is actually Henry Jones Jr. But Harrison Ford says, "Dad, I like Indiana." And Sean Connery says, "We named the dog Indiana." That is Sean Connery's best line, and yes, that is the hill I'm dying on. Anyway, the movie The Untouchables is a fictionalized version of the true story about how they got Al Capone. In real life, the feds were having a hard time convicting Capone for the violent crimes that he committed. They realized, however, that they could probably get him a different way, on tax evasion. That was actually how he ended up getting convicted. Well, when the trial was going on, since that was the way they were going, the key witness in the trial would be Capone's accountant, the guy who had all the information about Capone's finances. You see, bad guys need sophisticated professionals to help those bad guys hide their bad deeds. And that's why oftentimes a criminal's best friend is their accountant. Or their lawyer. For Jesse Ferguson and Julius Klein, a lawyer who could advise them on how to launder money through the Atlanta nightclub business was worth his weight in coke. Up until now, they were missing that piece of their business puzzle. But that was about to change. Willie Harris, one of those guys I mentioned briefly earlier who was part of the whole clubs and coke community in Atlanta, Willie Harris had an in with a professional athlete who was willing to rescue the now defunct club known as Dominique's. The athlete's name was Deion Sanders. Deion was drafted by the Atlanta Falcons only a year earlier, so he had a fresh infusion of money. He was ready to invest that cash and also ready to splash his name across the marquee of the hottest club in the city. Deion's nightclub would replace Dominique's in the very same building on Windy Hill Road. But the deal with Deion was going to be a little bit more complicated. There was going to be an investment portion, a marketing deal, and a management component. The group needed a top-notch lawyer to put it all together. So Willie Harris introduced the crew to Fred Tokars. Fred Tokars and his wife Sarah were a match made on television. Literally. One day when Sarah was watching TV, she saw Fred Tokars being interviewed about one of the cases he was working on. At the time, Fred was a hotshot prosecutor for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, and Sarah was instantly drawn to him. The more she learned about him, the more she became enamored, and the fact that they both happened to come from the same small town outside Buffalo, New York, well, that must have been the clincher. Sarah called Fred to ask him out, and before you knew it, they were married. They were perfect for each other. Sarah was a marketing executive who promoted clubs in the Atlanta area for years. Fred Tokars loved the Atlanta nightclub scene. That's partially how he earned his nickname, Fast Fred. Fred Tokars loved the fast life. Whether it was the fast Atlanta nightlife or the fast world of prosecuting dangerous criminals, Fred liked moving quickly, he loved operating in dangerous circles, and he was hoping to move up the financial ladder fast as well. He might have been prosecuting criminals today, but Fred Tokars had aspirations of wealthy clients and good times. After the couple got married, Sarah continued to work in the nightclub promotions business, but things started to change for the couple when Fred decided to leave the district attorney's office to pursue those larger aspirations. When Fred went into private practice, the source of his clientele was the industry that both he and his wife Sarah knew very well, the Atlanta nightclub industry. And, from a lawyer's standpoint, that made perfect sense. Fred Tokars was an accountant before he went to law school. He had a tax background. He understood how to arrange sophisticated business transactions. And he also had experience as a prosecutor, which means that he understood the underworld. All of that together meant that Fred Tokars had a special skill. He knew how to launder money. Fred Tokars was brought in by Jesse Ferguson, Julius Klein, and Willie Harris to put together the Deion Sanders club deal. They created Deion's Club 21, named after the number that Deion Sanders wore on his football jersey. Now, just like with Dominique's, it's highly likely that Deion Sanders had no idea that the people he was getting into business with were from the clubs and coke community. He didn't know where they got their money, and as far as he could tell, they were legitimate club operators. That's the reason they put James Mason in the front of the entire business. But Fred Tokars knew better, and so did his wife. Sarah Tokars worried for her husband. She knew that some of Fred's best clients would be the worst people. And she knew that those bad people would need her husband's services. That's because the early 90s was the time that money laundering laws were first being enacted, and that made guys like Fred Tokars far more valuable to the clubs and coke community. Fred Tokars built his practice methodically. He became the go-to guy when someone needed representation in the world of Atlanta nightclubs, and he provided a variety of services. He put deals together and he helped structure investments. He even represented the clubs and coke characters when they got arrested on drug charges. He was full service and he was developing a powerful clientele. And Fred Tokars, he was smart. He worked both sides of the system. At the same time he was representing all of these clubs and coke guys, he started to donate a lot of money to political campaigns. Fred was creating a network of powerful people, both inside the government and inside the criminal underworld. Fred's wife Sarah started to see a change in her husband around the time that Fred worked on that Deion Sanders deal. It seemed that Fred Tokars wanted more. He didn't want to just advise his clients in the drug and money laundering world. Fast Fred wanted to be a part of it. So, Fred began to embed himself in the clubs and coke world. It started when he made himself a corporate officer of one of the companies he was creating. Then, it got a little deeper when a deal was presented by one of the other members of the clubs and coke crew I mentioned earlier, Eddie Lawrence. Eddie Lawrence seems to have spent a little bit more time on the coke side of the business than on the club side of the business. And Lawrence wanted to, shall we say, expand his business opportunities in that coke side. Was he going to start selling more cocaine? No. Was he going to raise prices of the cocaine he sold? Also no. Eddie Lawrence decided that the best way to make more money was to print it. Eddie Lawrence went into the counterfeiting business. Lawrence's idea was that he'd print counterfeited money and use that fake cash to buy drugs wholesale. Then he'd sell those drugs on the street for real money. The scheme would let him make a crap ton more cash because he'd actually be paying nothing for the drugs to the suppliers because they were bought with counterfeit money, and then he'd sell those drugs for a boatload of real money on the streets. His lawyer, Fred Tokars, loved the idea. He loved it so much that he wanted in. Fred Tokars gave Eddie Lawrence $70,000 to get that money counterfeiting business started. That sort of investment was starting to cause problems for Fred at home. Between the money he was investing with his clients and the money he was donating to politicians, there was little left over for Sarah. And that's probably why Tokars started to get stingy. He told Sarah that she couldn't have her own credit cards, and he put her on a weekly allowance. Sarah didn't understand why money was so tight. Fred seemed to have a good practice. But she knew, because of her experience in the industry, that the people Fred was working with in the Atlanta clubs were bad news. She had a nagging feeling that Fred was getting into some bad situations. And while she worried for her husband, she didn't say anything. But refusing to face it only made things worse. When Sarah got pregnant with their first child, she wanted to stop working when the baby was born, but Fred wouldn't have it. They needed the money. After the baby was born, Fred seemed to be getting even more impatient around the house. That might have been because some people were poking around at work. It seemed that someone in the government got wind of that counterfeiting operation. I don't know if I could take a bullet for someone. I mean, my wife, for sure. My kids? Well, I would definitely take a bullet for my daughter. But my sons? I don't know. Now, there's only one reason. And the reason is my daughter is the only one of my children who listens to my podcast. So clearly she is bullet-taking worthy. But the boys have not listened to a single episode, so I need to question their love. Of course, I'm joking. Of course, I would take a bullet for my children. But would I take a bullet for someone else? Yeah, probably not. Like, I could never be a Secret Service agent. They have to be willing to take a bullet for the president, and I'm not sure that I can do that. Fun fact, did you know that protecting the president was not what the Secret Service was created for? The original mission of the Secret Service when it was created in 1865 was to take on counterfeiting. Yeah, and they still do that function today. The agency responsible for investigating counterfeiting operations in the United States is the Secret Service Agency. And in the mid-1990s, The Secret Service got wind of Eddie Lawrence's counterfeiting operation. So they started sniffing around. Fred Tokars had to be worried. He helped fund the operation. That meant that it was in his interest to help Eddie get out of trouble. Fred Tokars decided to offer his unique skills to Eddie Lawrence. Fred offered to help Eddie get rid of the counterfeit money by laundering it in the Bahamas. Eddie considered Fred's offer, but declined. Eddie Lawrence was going to take care of it on his own, and that could not have made Fred Tokars happy. The Secret Service was snooping around a deal that he was involved in. The pressure was getting to Fred. His behavior at home became even more concerning. He stopped coming home at reasonable hours, and it got to the point that he rarely had dinner at home at all. Sarah's concern had grown so much that she started poking around the house to see what was going on with her husband. Her fears were confirmed when she found mounds of cash in the house. Sarah was no dummy. She knew the types of clients who would be paying their lawyers' bills with cash. Even though Sarah was genuinely afraid for her husband, she still didn't confront him. She couldn't. Based on how he was behaving lately, she was sure that he'd fly off the handle. And Fred Tokars' strange behavior only got stranger. Around the time that Sarah and Fred had their second child, Fred's behavior at home went from concerning to controlling. Fred put Sarah on a strict cash-only allowance. He gave her $600 a month, and that barely paid for food, mortgage, or the clothes on their backs. Sarah tried to rebel in small ways. She quietly obtained credit cards in her names, which she used whenever her husband either refused to give her money or was away from home. But that wasn't a great solution because she didn't have the money to pay the bills when they came due. And then Fred went from controlling to possessive. At one point, he told his wife that she wasn't allowed to go visit her family. As the tension mounted between the two, so did the fighting. And it wasn't just verbal. Once, when the couple was invited to a party being thrown by one of Fred's lawyer friends, Sarah politely declined the invitation. She explained, I'm so sorry we can't make it. Things are just a little hectic at home. The lawyer throwing the party was upset. He pressed Sarah. Sarah, you need to be there. It won't be the same without you and Fred. Sarah said, I feel bad, but... She paused. I'm not well. Oh, I didn't know, the lawyer replied. I'm so sorry. Are you sick? Sarah put her mouth close to the phone and spoke quietly into the receiver. I can't come. I have bruises on my arm, and Fred, I just can't come. And then Sarah hung up the phone. As if things couldn't get any worse for Sarah, she soon began to suspect that Fred was cheating. There were times where Fred would call home to tell his wife that he'd be working late, and while Fred was on the phone, Sarah could hear the chatter of women's voices in the background. Sarah started to believe that someday she might have to leave her husband. Their lives simply couldn't go on like this. But despite everything happening around her, she couldn't just up and leave. Sarah knew how controlling her husband had become, and over the years, Fred had made some passing comments that put her on notice. He told her that if she ever tried to divorce him, he would fight tooth and nail for full custody of the kids. And between the judges he knew from practicing law and the politicians he had in his pocket from years of smart campaign donations, there was no way that he'd lose. Sarah talked to some divorce lawyers, and all of them confirmed that Fred had a really good shot at getting custody of the kids. That's why Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave her husband. Fred's possessive nature gave way to paranoia pretty quickly. He realized that the people who knew about his involvement in the clubs and coke world could sink him if they ever got pinched. They could all make deals to turn Fred in order to save their own asses. That might be why Fred Tokars made such a strange request to one of his clients/business partners. Al Brown, one of the clubs and coke crew, was arrested for selling coke. Of course, he went to Fred to represent him. After reviewing the file, Fred gave Brown the bad news. The cops had a ton of evidence, and there was a good chance he was going to jail for a long time. Brown was outright scared. He told his lawyer, I don't know what I'm going to do, Fred. I can't go to jail for decades. Fred Tokars then offered some advice that was highly unusual for a defense lawyer. He didn't talk to his client about pleading to a lesser charge or discuss some novel trial strategy. Fred said, "There's only one way for you to get out of this, Al. You need to set someone up." "What do you mean, set someone up? You mean snitch?" Brown couldn't believe it. "Yeah," Fred confirmed. "They have the evidence against you, and you're going to go away for a long time. The only way for you to get out of this is by giving them someone bigger than you, someone up the ladder." "Like who?" Brown asked, and Fred paused. "You need to give them Julius Klein." Brown looked at Fred like he had two heads. "Are you fucking crazy? You want me to set up Julius Klein? Not a chance. Not a fucking chance." Fred realized that he'd gone too far. He tried to wave it off. You're right. You're right," he said. "You're right, man. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm just trying to help you out." Brown shook his head. "Yeah, well, think of a way to help me out that won't get me killed, huh?" Was Fred Tokars trying to get rid of people? It's exactly the sort of thing that a paranoid person might try to do. And Fred's paranoia was increasing. Around this time, he prepared his will. Around this time, he got life insurance. Was all of that overkill? Fred surely didn't think so. After all, the Secret Service were looking into the counterfeiting operation, and recently he heard that the Atlanta police had Fred Tokars on the radar as well. I mean, how could they not have him on their radar? Every time someone from the Clubs and Coke crew got arrested, there was Fred Tokars defending them. Every time one of them did a deal, there was Fred Tokars arranging their business relationships. And these were complicated deals. The police was sure that Tokars wasn't just creating these business entities. He was teaching these guys how to launder money. The Secret Service and the Atlanta police weren't the only people poking around Fred Tokars' life. His wife, Sarah, had also decided to increase her snooping. Sarah offered to help her husband around the office. She explained, "Listen, money is tight. Maybe I could help ease the administrative burden." She could help Fred collect the money that clients owed. So Fred agreed, and Sarah started to work on Tokars' accounts receivable. Fred might have thought that his wife was helping, but the truth was she was searching. Sarah was trying to gather evidence she could use for that inevitable time that she had to leave her husband. It started to pay off. Sarah found foreign bank accounts that had a lot of money. Slowly but steadily, Sarah continued to gather information. She made copies of documents and kept notes about what she'd found. But even though she felt as though she was building a case against her husband, she had not yet found that smoking gun. Fred Tokars might not have specifically realized that the police and his wife were closing in on him, but he certainly felt the pressure building. But in mid-1992, he got a little bit of relief. In July, Julius Klein went on a trip to his old neighborhood, Detroit. It seems like it was a drug run. Well, whatever he was running toward turned out to be bad, and he ended up in a shootout on a Detroit street. It didn't end well for Julius. Klein was shot to death in the middle of the street in Detroit. That probably made Fred Tokars feel somewhat relieved. At least one of the few people who knew the details of Fred Tokars' criminal involvement was now dead. Sarah needed that smoking gun evidence. To find it, she hired a private detective. The PI confirmed that Fred Tokars was indeed having an affair, but that wasn't going to be enough. Sarah needed more, and she was running out of time. Things were falling apart in her life, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold on. Money was so tight that they couldn't afford to make the most basic repairs around the house. Repairs like fixing a broken air conditioner in Georgia in the middle of the summer. And that's why Sarah Tokars found herself sweating while standing in the basement of her home on a sweltering August day. Sarah Tokars stood in her basement in front of that safe, looking intently into the eyes of the man standing next to her. That man, however, was not looking at Sarah. He was staring at the contents of the safe that Sarah had just opened. Sarah asked him again, "So, what do you think?" Sarah's private detective chuckled nervously. "What do I think?" He shook his head and rubbed his chin. "I think I'm not touching any of this. I think it's illegal for me to touch any of it, and I think I should leave this basement." That was not the response Sarah Tokars wanted to hear. She tried again to get the detective to look at the stuff inside the safe. The detective crouched down and moved his face closer to the open box. He peered into it without touching anything. He saw documents, vials of prescription medication, and a bunch of bags with some other stuff inside. Sarah asked the detective to take the papers. She said, "Reach in there, grab them, copy them, then help me figure out what they mean." But the detective was having none of it. Taking the documents would probably be breaking the law. Sarah was probably devastated that the private detective wouldn't dive deeper into the case, and it left her no choice. She had to look through the contents on her own. She was glad she did. Not too long after that meeting, Sarah called her friend elated. She said, "I finally found the information I need so that I can get a divorce from Fred. I'm going to get a lawyer and turn all this paperwork over to them. There's no way Fred will be able to get custody of the kids when the court sees who he's been involved with and what he's been doing." On August 5th, 1992, a car was driving down the road in Amarillo, Texas. No one knows what made the cop pull the vehicle over. No one knows who was driving it. What we do know, however, is that there was 115 grams of cocaine inside that car. When the cops pressured the driver, they learned that the drugs were headed to Atlanta, Georgia. And that's when the DEA decided to put together a sting operation. The agency airlifted the car to Georgia and then told the driver to deliver the drugs as originally intended. When the delivery was made, they busted the recipient. The guy they arrested was Al Brown, supplier for Julius Klein and client of Fred Tokars. After they arrested Brown, they found all kinds of evidence in his home. There were money counting machines, a bulletproof vest, beepers, and all sorts of documents and records. A bunch of those documents showed his connection to the Atlanta nightclub industry. When law enforcement looked through all the evidence, they thought, there he was again. There was Fred Tokars, all over everything. The lawyer who popped up every time one of these clubs and coke guys got into trouble. The guy who put all their deals together. To assist in the investigation of this matter, the DEA brought in the Internal Revenue Service. And that is when Fred Tokars' ears truly perked up. If there was any agency that scared a former accountant turned criminal like Fred Tokars, it was the IRS. And that is because Fred knew how the IRS worked. He knew the tactics they used to get criminals. It was a tactic they first used against Al Capone in that movie The Untouchables. The IRS got the bad guys by charging them with tax evasion. Fred knew that the IRS would start to look at the books and records of the deals he created. He knew that those financial records could do him in. His fears were confirmed when the IRS subpoenaed a woman who worked in the clubs associated with Tokars. Fred knew she didn't have any knowledge about the drug crimes, and she didn't have any particular information about the details of things like, shares of ownerships and deals and stuff like that. But she did know who the players were. She knew who all the partners were in those deals, even if she didn't know much about the rest of the details. And Fred Tokars knew that that was why the IRS wanted to talk to her. They were putting together the pieces of a puzzle that would end up creating a case of tax evasion against Fred Tokars. What was once paranoia was now outright fear. And the more he thought about it, one person scared him the most. It wasn't that woman who was subpoenaed. She didn't have a level of detail that made him concerned. It wasn't Julius Klein. He was dead. It wasn't Willie Harris. He went to jail after he was busted for drugs. It was the one person who had access to all of the financial information back at his office. It was his wife, Sarah. The time had come for Fred Tokars to do something about his wife. And what Sarah didn't know is that Fred had actually contemplated this moment for some time. Sarah didn't know that in that will her husband created, he didn't make Sarah the guardian of his children. He made his brother the guardian. Sarah also didn't know that that life insurance policy Fred took out, it wasn't for his life. It was to ensure Sarah's life. And Fred was the beneficiary. Fred met with one of the members of his clubs and coke crew, his fellow counterfeiter, Eddie Lawrence. Fred complained to Eddie about the situation. He said, I know my fucking wife has found shit on me, Eddie. I can feel it. She wants to leave me. If she does, she's going to take everything, and I can't let that happen. Eddie tried to calm down his friend. Yes, you can, man. Listen, it's just money. Let her have all that shit. With the business we're doing, you can make it back in no time. But Fred Tokars was not in a compromising mood. Screw that, he said. I went to school at night to get my degree. I work my ass off. And what does she do? Nothing. All she ever does is spend my money, and you can bet your ass I'm not going to go and give more of it to her. Eddie said, look, take it easy, Fred. Let her have what she wants and just keep on doing business. You'll be better off in the long run. No way, Fred said. I would kill her before I let her take my shit away. Eddie laughed. Yeah, sure, Mr. Lawyer. You're going to kill your wife? Not a chance. Stick to the paperwork, my friend, and leave the hard criminal stuff to the hard criminals. Fred looked at Eddie. Which hard criminals? You? Eddie looked at Fred, expressionless. Tokars leaned in. He repeated, hard criminals like you? Tell me, man, if I asked you, would you kill my wife for me? Eddie Lawrence furrowed his brow and narrowed his eyes. He pursed his lip and shook his head slightly. He said, how can you even think of that, man? You have kids. Tokars, however, was serious. He said, the kids will be all right. They're young. They'll get over it. Behind Fred's expressionless face, he was probably thrilled. It seemed like Eddie Lawrence was actually considering it. And that's when Fred went in for the kill. He offered Lawrence $25,000 to kill his wife. But Lawrence wasn't biting. Get the fuck out of here, Fred. You're losing your mind. Tokars sweetened the deal. He said, listen, I got a life insurance policy on her. It's for almost $2 million. I'll give you part of it. Eddie Lawrence sat silently. He couldn't believe that Tokars was seriously asking him to do this. Fred continued the pressure. He said, do it in my office in Atlanta. I've invested a lot in my political contacts. No one's going to make a fuss at all. Lawrence was not convinced. That makes no sense, he said. Politicians are not going to cover up a murder just because you donated to their campaign. Fine, Tokars said. Then do it in my house. We can make it look like a burglary. Eddie got up and walked around the room, rubbing his forehead. But with each step Eddie took, Tokars could feel the opportunity slipping away. So Fred changed his tone. He got angry. He said, okay, listen to me, Eddie. If you don't do this for me, I'm going to destroy your fucking business. I know who you work with. I know who your suppliers are. I know where you keep all your money. If you don't help me take care of my wife, I'll make sure to torch it all. Eddie Lawrence knew that Fred Tokars was right. He actually could destroy everything Lawrence worked for. Fred was the one guy who knew where all the bodies were buried. Regardless, it was a fucked up thing to ask someone to do. Eddie Lawrence took a deep breath and gathered his resolve. He looked at Fred Tokars right in the eyes and said with as much determination as he could muster, I'm not fucking doing it. But I know a guy who will. The guy Eddie Lawrence knew was Curtis Rower. Rower was a crack addict who always needed money. Eddie Lawrence offered Rower $5,000 for what he must have described was an easy gig, to kill a 40-year-old unarmed woman. That kind of money would buy a nice bunch of rocks on the street, and that's probably why Curtis Rower agreed to do the deed. The plan was to do it around the holidays. The Tokars family was going to Florida for Thanksgiving. Sarah would be driving with the kids. Sarah would be driving down with her 2 little boys. They were now 4 and 6 years old. Fred was going to fly to Tampa and meet them. After the holiday, Sarah would head back to Georgia with the boys, and Fred would go to Alabama to meet with a client. Fred told Eddie Lawrence and Curtis Rower that he wanted Sarah dead when she got back from Florida. When the holidays came, everything went forward as expected. Sarah and the kids drove down to Florida the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and Fred flew into Tampa the same day and met them. The family had what appears to have been a pleasant Thanksgiving. On Saturday after the holiday, Sarah and the kids drove back to their home outside Atlanta as planned. Fred went to Alabama for the meeting with his client. He checked into a Montgomery hotel, and from there he called his answering service to check the messages. Just the sort of call that could establish an alibi. Eddie Lawrence picked up Curtis Rower about 7 p.m. Rower was carrying a sawed-off shotgun. Lawrence drove Rower to the Tokars' house. He dropped Rower off and told him to go in there and kill Sarah Tokars. After dropping off Rower, Eddie Lawrence drove to a neighboring subdivision to wait. But Sarah, she wasn't home yet. So Curtis Rower waited. 2 hours later, Curtis Rower saw a car pull up to the house. Sarah drove her white Toyota 4Runner SUV into the driveway, and as the family got out of the car, Curtis Rower jumped out of the darkness and ambushed them. Rower pointed his sawed-off shotgun at the family. He shouted them, "Get back into the car!" They did exactly as they were told, and Rower got into the car with Sarah and her 2 small sons. Rower was sitting in the front seat, his shotgun pointing directly at Sarah's head. He demanded that she drive, and she did. Rower told her that she was going to take him back to Atlanta. If Curtis Rower were to turn around at that moment and look out the rear mirror, he would have seen Eddie Lawrence following behind. Lawrence must have grown impatient waiting for so long, so he started to drive around a bit. And when he noticed Sarah's vehicle, he started to tail it. Meanwhile, in the 4Runner, Curtis was giving directions to Sarah, telling her where to drive, all the while holding the gun against her head. He would shout, "Turn left!" and she'd comply. "Turn right!" and she'd comply again. But Sarah knew where all this was heading. She and her children were being kidnapped by a person with a loaded shotgun. She had to protect her 2 boys. Sarah, it seems, was willing to potentially take a bullet to protect her children. She decided she had to make her move. The next time Curtis told Sarah to turn, she refused. She let out a shriek and with all of her might pushed Curtis down on the floorboards. Curtis was probably shocked and furious. He sat up and raised his gun. Sarah turned her head instinctively, sensing the inevitable. And then Curtis Rower shot Sarah Tokars in the back of the head at point-blank range. The car careened off the road into a ditch. Eddie Lawrence, who was driving behind them, saw the 4Runner drive off the road and he pulled up behind it. As Eddie got out of his car, he saw Curtis get out of the 4Runner covered in blood. He jumped into Eddie's car and they took off. Sarah's car was left in that ditch, and the scene inside that car was like one from a horror movie. I will spare you the description of what the car looked like and what the boys looked like, but it's exactly as you'd expect. The 2 young boys eventually got out of the car and ran to a nearby home about 100 yards away. When the homeowner opened the door, he saw 2 young boys covered in blood. The boys looked up and said, "Our mom's been shot." The next day, Fred Tokars was at his home on his driveway, being consoled by a friend of his. He stood on the driveway, sobbing uncontrollably while being embraced by his friend. The story in the papers was that Sarah got home with the kids and stumbled into a burglary in process. They were kidnapped, and she was killed. The newspaper ran stories about the case for months while the investigation was going on. The name Tokars appeared in print over 1,000 times. While Fred Tokars seemed to be a sympathetic figure to start with, slowly, all of his business relationships began to be revealed, and the profile of the true Fred Tokars started to emerge. Eventually, Eddie Lawrence and Curtis Rower were arrested. Initially, Eddie wouldn't talk, but then, as usually happens in these cases, he decided to testify and plead guilty in return for leniency. So he told the police about everything. When Fred Tokars was arrested, his lawyer told the press that Fred was in shock. His lawyer explained, "We never expected an arrest because my client's innocent. These are trumped-up charges based on lies." But in the end, the only lies were being told by Fred Tokars. Fred Tokars was found guilty of federal racketeering charges. He was sentenced to life without parole. He was then tried for murder, where he was also found guilty. The jury could not agree on the death penalty, So Fred Tokars was sent to jail for life. Conspiracy theorists believe that Fred Tokars' case had an interesting and somewhat unexpected effect on the careers of two people we discussed at the beginning of this episode, Dominique Wilkins and Deion Sanders. Some people believe that Fred Tokars is the reason that both Dominique and Deion left Atlanta. It's all speculation, of course, and both athletes deny the connection, but it's interesting to think about it. When the truth came out, Fred Tokars' relationship with the Dominique and Deion clubs was revealed. Sure, the athletes didn't have any connection to Tokars' bad acts, but just being mentioned in the same breath with Fred Tokars appeared to be a blemish. Now think about the timing. Tokars was found guilty in December of 1993. 3 months after the conviction, Dominique Wilkins, a superstar with the Atlanta Hawks for over 11 years, Dominique Wilkins was traded to the Los Angeles Clippers. And only a month after the conviction, NFL superstar Deion Sanders played his last game with the Atlanta Falcons. He signed with the San Francisco 49ers. Now, that timing could be coincidence. But some people have pointed out that there are good reasons to question those sports moves. For Dominique, the trade happened mid-season, and at the time, it was the only instance in NBA history where a first-place team traded its leading scorer after the All-Star break. Deion's case was likewise confusing. He was one of the hottest players in the game, and he left Atlanta to take a measly 1-year, $1.2 million contract to go across the country to San Francisco. He says it was because he wanted to be on a winning team. But conspiracy theorists believe that because those two athletes were connected with Fred Tokars, even tangentially, it ended their time in Atlanta. Fred Tokars died in prison in 2020. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. There's an interesting story about what happened to Fred Tokars in jail, and I might post that as a bit of a mini episode. It depends if I have time to actually do the research. Keep your eyes open for another episode of the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast in just a couple of weeks. Oh, and I wasn't kidding about my daughter being the only one of my children who listens to this podcast, and I know that she listens to it when she drives to work. So, Haley, drive carefully, and I love you.